Hello, Dr. Jenkins here. This is our third chapter of this semester. And in this chapter, we're going to begin to talk about muscles, skeletal muscles, and the fuel sources for these muscles. This is sports nutrition, right? Look at Usain Bolt. Sports nutrition. So since we have already introduced the nutrients, we talked about those last chapter, remember? We talked about the macronutrients and micronutrients, and I'm going to give you a big smiley face because you love it. So we have a basic understanding of the nutrients. Well, the other part of sports nutrition is understanding the muscles. Because these muscles, these skeletal muscles, are what we're going to be relying on to help us complete these physical activities. So it's important for us to know the structure of these muscles, how they work, and then how these muscles use energy, how they get fuel. Okay, so here's the outline for this chapter. As I said, we're going to talk about the muscle, give you a little bit of an intro to that, and then we're going to talk about how these muscles get fuel and how they use it. This is a shorter chapter than chapter 2, our last chapter, so that's good news. Here's our friend Usain Bolt. You'll see from time to time I'll be using real-life examples and comparing, for example, how the muscles and fuel sources for Usain Bolt, who's a sprinter, might be different than the fuel sources used by muscles for a marathon runner. So we'll talk about that later, but just to give him some appreciation for what he does. He had the 100-meter record, 9.56, or is it 8? Can't tell. Either way, it's fast. The maximum speed he achieved in that world record 100-meter run, 27.3 miles per hour. Can you imagine running? Like, I just think about being in a car, even going 25 miles an hour, and running faster than that. His average speed was a little bit lower because, as you know, these sprinters start from a dead stop, so there has to be some time to accelerate. But his max speed, 27.3, that's just unbelievable. All right, so let's begin this chapter by talking about the structure of muscle. Just had some water there, folks, sorry. Now, there's actually 3 types of muscle in the body. There's skeletal muscle, which is what you think of. This is the muscle that makes up your biceps brachii, your trapezius, your quads, your hamstrings. There's also, of course, cardiac muscle, which is the muscle that makes up the walls of your heart. And then there's also smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is the type of muscle that's found in the walls of your GI tract organs. And there's also a little bit of smooth muscle in the walls of your arteries. These are all important for exercise. We're going to focus mostly on the skeletal muscle. All right? What we find is that skeletal and cardiac muscle are very similar. So when we start talking about the structure of skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is very similar, just with some minor differences. But we're going to focus on skeletal muscle. We have over 600 skeletal muscles, which is impressive. We obviously know the big groups of skeletal muscles: quads, hamstrings, biceps, triceps, latissimus dorsi, trapezius. But that number gets to be so high because of all the smaller muscles. Think about all the small muscles that you have in your feet, in your hands, the muscles around your eyes and your mouth. So that's why the number gets up so high. Make sure you review the basic characteristics of skeletal muscle. Here we can see a picture of it's a histology slide. So imagine if we took a sample of skeletal muscle and put it on a microscope and looked at it under high power. This is what you would see. It has these things called striations. And if you look at it, don't you see these vertical lines? Almost looks like it's a zebra stripe. What that means is that the muscle is striated. Smooth muscle, as it happens, is not striated. That's where it gets its name, smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is the only type of muscle tissue we have that is voluntarily controlled. If you think about this, you know, if you want to contract your biceps brachii, you voluntarily do it. On the other hand, cardiac muscle, which is the muscle that makes up the walls of your heart, cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntarily controlled. You don't have to voluntarily tell, oh yeah, cardiac muscle, contract again, contract again. If you had to do that, we would, of course, forget. But skeletal muscle is the only of these three muscle tissues that is voluntarily controlled. Skeletal muscle is able to contract very rapidly, but it does tend to tire more easily than the other muscles. Okay, so some of the benefits of skeletal muscle is that it can contract really quickly, but it does tire more easily than the cardiac and the smooth muscle. Okay, now, don't be intimidated by this. Please, please, please. We're going to talk about the basic structure of a skeletal muscle. Let me change to blue. So if you were to look at the whole muscle, this could be any muscle. Let's take your biceps brachii. Everyone knows where that is. If you were to look at that muscle under a microscope, you would see that it has these little groupings. It's almost like if you had an electrical cord, like any kind of electrical cable, even like the power cord for your iPhone. You know, if you slice it in half and you look at the cross section, you'll see, even though it's a big cord, you'll see tiny little structures inside. Okay? So the muscle is actually that way. It has these tiny little groupings, and these groupings are actually called fascicles. You can see that fascicle is not starred, so you don't have to know that bundle. But as we try and move from the biggest pieces of the muscle into the smaller and smaller pieces, I think it's helpful to start big and then go smaller. So we have the big muscle, and it has these smaller groupings. They're called fascicles, but you don't have to know that. And then each fascicle is made up of these individual muscle fibers. Okay? So let's say that we have a quiz question, and I have this same exact picture as you see on your screen to the right. And I ask you, what is this? You're going to be able to say it's a muscle fiber. It's not the whole grouping here. It's not the whole grouping, but that grouping is made up of individual fibers. There's one muscle fiber. Here's another muscle fiber. Here's another muscle fiber. The muscle fibers are made up of even smaller things called myofibrils. So we talked about muscle fibers. The muscle fibers are composed of smaller bundles called myofibrils. And then the myofibrils contain the smallest pieces, which are called the myofilaments. I know that these words kind of sound similar, so you may just want to memorize it as biggest to smallest. So we had the muscle fibers. The muscle fibers are made up of myofibrils. And the myofibrils are made up of the smallest pieces of the skeletal muscle, which are called the myofilaments. Or maybe you want to go from small to big. Myofilaments form myofibrils, form muscle fibers. What I want to point out here is those myofibrils. We love the myofibrils. These are the pieces that are contractile. When you contract your biceps brachii, the muscle actually gets shorter, but what exactly is contracting? The myofilaments. So you should know that these are the smallest pieces, made up of little proteins, of course. The myofilaments are the smallest pieces that are the ones that actually contract. Okay. Here's an actual look at a cross-section of a muscle. It's pretty cool. Let me do blue. So here we have the whole muscle, right? So imagine the whole biceps. The biceps is made up of these groupings. They were called fascicles, but you didn't have to know that. But those fascicles are made up of muscle fibers. Here's a muscle fiber. Here's a muscle fiber. Here's a muscle fiber. Each muscle fiber is made up of these smaller dots called myofibrils. And then if we were to pull out these myofibrils, we would see the smallest units called the myofilaments. But see, I'm not lying to you. This is what the muscle really looks like, right? So here it is up top, and here it is in real life. That's pretty cool. Now, it turns out that those muscle fibers, there's two main types, and this is really important. Two main types of muscle fibers. Let me go back to this picture, and we can see the muscle fibers, right? I'm pointing to the screen. Oh, look at that. The muscle fibers. Sometimes we'll call those muscle fibers muscle cells, but it turns out that there's two main types of muscle fibers. There are type 1 and type 2. Maybe you've actually heard of this. This is really important stuff. So there's type 1 muscle fibers, which are considered to be our slow twitch muscle fibers. And then there are type 2 muscle fibers, which are considered to be our fast twitch. Now, look at the bottom here. When we're contracting muscles, we're always using a combination of both. So every muscle has both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. And no matter what you're doing, you're going to be activating some of both. But these muscle fiber types are specialized. And that means that depending on the activity, you might be relying more on one type than the other. Even though you're always going to be contracting some of both, depending on the activity you're doing, you might be using more of one than the other. So here are some examples. Let's talk about type 1. These are our slow twitch muscle fibers. These are the muscle fibers that contract weaker. Actually, I want to change color. Ooh, look at that. Let's go to blue. I've been liking blue today. The type 1 or slow twitch contract weaker, but can last. They can contract for a longer period of time. So this might be used more in endurance activities. In endurance activities, apparently I can't talk and write at the same time. Endurance activities, you're not going as intense, so a weaker contraction is okay, but you need those muscles to be able to contract for a long period of time. So actually here I am doing the Ironman. The Ironman triathlon would definitely be utilizing more of the type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. On the other hand, our fast twitch muscle fibers are much stronger in how intense they can contract. But because they're contracting with such intensity, or they're contracting so strongly, they cannot contract for as long. So we would be utilizing more of the fast twitch muscle fibers in a sprint or a weightlifter, as I have this dude down here. Okay? Last thing I want to point out is that the slow twitch muscle fibers require oxygen. So when we're contracting the slow twitch or type 1 muscle fibers, in order for those type 1 muscle fibers to contract, they must have oxygen. They'll need fuel too, but they must have oxygen. The type 2 require much less oxygen. Very little. Very little to none. But our type 1 are oftentimes considered to be the aerobic muscle fibers. And aerobic just means requires oxygen. Okay, so key points, we're always using both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, but we can be using more of one than the other, depending on what activity we're doing. And, by the way, when you're an athlete in training, you're purposely training these muscle fibers for whatever activity it is that you want to perform. You want to see some real pictures? I got some real pictures for you. Here we see some cross sections of the muscle, skeletal muscle, but now they've been stained in such a way that we can separate the type 1, which is a lighter brown. So here's our type 1, type 1, type 1. Here's our type 1, the lighter brown. And then the dark brown are the type 2 muscle fibers. So what do you notice? In the endurance athlete, their muscle composition is likely to have many more type 1 muscle fibers, because they are requiring more of type 1 muscle fiber activity. A lower level contraction, but the muscles that can stay contracted for a long period of time. Versus our sprinter or our strength athlete, who has many fewer type 1 muscle fibers, but many more type 2. But either way, every muscle is going to have some combination of both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. There's so much I could say about this, because it really depends on the muscle group too. Some muscle groups are going to have more type 2 muscle fibers just because of the muscle group that it is, like your calf muscle, your gastroc. One of the big questions in exercise science for a long period of time is, through your training, can you convert one type of muscle fiber to the other? And the answer is, and this is not going to be on the test, I'm not writing it down, right? Can you convert some of these? Maybe, but maybe not to the extent that we once thought. Age also plays a role. We tend to maximize our type 2 muscle fiber ability earlier, so maybe late 20s, mid to late 20s, maybe late 20s, is when you're going to have maximal type 2 muscle fiber. So if you look at sprinters, usually they reach their maximum capabilities end of 20s, whereas the type 1 muscle fibers, they can tend to stick around later. So a lot of our endurance athletes are doing their best work well into their 30s. So much to say, though. Okay, so we're going to come back to this, and I want to talk for a moment about those myofilaments, right? So remember, we had the muscle fiber. The muscle fiber is made up of myofibrils, and the myofibrils are made up of myofilaments. And as I pointed out before, these are the ones that are contractile. They're the ones that are actually going to slide past each other to enable muscle contraction. There are two types of myofilaments. So we have actin and myosin. Maybe you've heard about these before. Actin is the thin one. Here it's shown as yellow. And myosin is a slightly thicker myofilament. But just be able to identify those. Actin and myosin are the specific types of myofilaments. Actin is thin, myosin is thick. When you're talking about rebuilding muscle after exercise, we're usually talking about the actin and myosin, these proteins. The way that I remember actin being thin is that I think about actors in our superficial society. Actors, in TV shows and movies, actors have to be thin. So I think about actin as a thin myofilament. And then by process of elimination, myosin is the thicker one. If some of these things work for you, great. If not, maybe you can think of something that works for you. So here's another way of looking at the actin and myosin. You don't have to know these things specifically, but I just wanted to give you some other viewpoints. Because when you take a cross-section microscopically of the skeletal muscle, it's possible to look at the actin and myosin arranged in this horizontal pattern, where we have the actin, here it's shown as blue, and then the myosin is shown as red. And what these myofilaments do is they're actually like alternating. There's a thin, then a thick, thin, then a thick. There's actin, myosin, actin, myosin. And when the muscle is at rest, indeed, this top picture is when a skeletal muscle is at rest. The actin and myosin are hanging out, alternating, actin, myosin, but there's a space in between because the muscle is relaxed. When the muscle contracts, the myofilaments slide together because they're contractile. So when the muscle contracts, this space goes away. I think on the next slide I got some better pictures. Let's see. I'm going to come back to that. Yeah, here's what I want to look at. So the idea that I'd like you to understand here is that when a muscle is relaxed, the alternating actin is blue, myosin is red, right? The alternating actin and myosin, when the muscle is relaxed, there's a space in between the actin. And this is another way of looking at it on a microscope slide. Look, there's a space between the actin. However, when a muscle contracts, the actin have slid together. Actually, the actin and myosin both have to work together. But when the muscle's contracted, there's no longer a space. The space that was present here is now gone. Okay, so the actin and myosin are arranged interchangeably, alternating, actin, myosin. And when the skeletal muscle is at rest, there's a little bit of space between the ends of the actin and myosin. On this picture, it shows you that there's space between the actin in a relaxed muscle. But when the muscle contracts, that actin slides together. And that's what causes the muscle to contract. If you look at a muscle, let's look here at this woman. That's why I put her on here. When a muscle is relaxed, let's look at the bicep. We know the bicep. There's my bicep. When the muscle is relaxed, the muscle is long. It's relaxed. When she does a bicep curl, which is when you contract the bicep, the muscle gets shorter. Okay, so when a muscle gets shorter, it's contracting. It's enabling to give us some force to move something. And what's happening microscopically is that the actin is sliding together to make the muscle shorter. That's pretty cool. This process is called the sliding filament theory. Okay, so the process of how those actin and myosin, right? We have the actin. Hold on here. We have the actin, then we have the myosin. And they're arranged interchangeably in the muscle. The sliding filament theory is the theory of what I just talked about. The sliding filament theory is how the myofilaments slide together to cause contraction. The sliding filament theory, how the myofilaments slide together to cause contraction. Boom! The rest here is extra. You don't need to know the cross bridge or the power stroke. We're keeping a pretty general view here. If you take anatomy and physiology or other exercise science courses, you will definitely get into more of the specifics of this. Cool. Okay, so the next step, now that we have a basic understanding of the structure of skeletal muscle, we need to talk about how do these skeletal muscles get fuel? In order for those myofilaments to slide past one another, they need fuel. Just like a car, if you're going to ask it to go, it needs gasoline. So let's talk about how these muscle cells get that fuel. Okay, you can see that I skipped a lot of this stuff below for now because we're going to get to it. But just follow with me. The first point that is important to make, we've already talked about carbs and fat, and to a much lesser extent, protein. But we know that carbs and fat, after we ingest them and after they get broken down, carbs and fat can be used for our cells by energy. But the thing is, let's take glucose, for example. We remember glucose as a monosaccharide, right? It is a one sugar carbohydrate. And we remember that carbs is what our muscle cells go to first for energy. See, you're going to have to be remembering this stuff because it always comes back. So let's talk about glucose. We know that glucose is a monosaccharide, can give our muscle cells quick energy, and that is true. It can give our cells energy. However, the glucose itself is not in a usable form. We have to do an extra step. So if we look at the molecule of glucose, it's just not in a usable form. So we have an added step. We have to convert all of that glucose into something called ATP, because ATP is in a usable form, which means that it can be used directly as fuel for our muscle cells. Okay? You don't have to know adenosine triphosphate specifically. It's not a spelling bee. ATP is just shorthand for adenosine triphosphate. But what we're saying here is for a muscle, and that's my picture of a muscle, we know that glucose and fat can be used as energy, but they have to be converted first to ATP. And then that ATP is what goes into the muscle as a usable form of energy. In other words, it is ATP that actually causes the actin and myosin to slide together. Hopefully you're with me. I can't look out and see your bored faces. I mean, not that students are ever bored in my class. No, no, no. But as always, I am here if you have questions, okay? I really try and break it down to the most important parts. So what we're saying is there's just an added step. We can't just shove glucose into a muscle. It's just not in the right molecular form. So there's an added step. And we're going to give fuel to our muscle cells. We have to first convert glucose into ATP. And then ATP is that usable energy source. Now, how do we produce ATP? How do cells produce this ATP? Through 3 pathways. So the process of converting that fat into glucose, or taking that glucose itself, the process of converting that glucose into ATP, which is that usable form of energy, occurs through 3 pathways. 1, 2, 3. This is the process where we convert that glucose into ATP. We know we have to do it because ATP is that usable energy source for our muscle cells. But now we have to mention how it happens. And how it happens, how we convert that glucose into ATP, is through a complex series of chemical reactions. And here they are. Now, this is true for any cell. I know we're talking about skeletal muscles, but any cell needs energy. So this process happens in pretty much every cell, because every cell needs ATP. It's just that our focus is on the muscle cells. All right. So I'm going to pause to end part 1 of this video. And then when we come back for part 2, we're going to finish this chapter. Stay tuned, folks.